So everyone, welcome to the Columbus JavaScript user group, or as we're calling it now, ColumbusJS, which is a lot easier to say. And I keep saying the other thing out of years of ingrained habit. So welcome to ColumbusJS. We've got Ryan Lanciaux here tonight. He's going to be presenting a talk, You Might Not Need Webpack, which sounds like fantastic news. And so I think I'm kind of curious to see what he's got to say. I got a little preview of his slides. It's rocking that 80s Miami Vice look. So it's already got at least one thumb up for me.
It's all downhill from here.
Yeah. If you're new, we do this every month on the third Wednesday. We got Ryan this month, and I'll talk about who's coming next month and for the rest of the year after that when he's done. But we'd encourage you to join us, of course, on Meetup and on Zoom and on our Discord, which the link will be in chat briefly. So if you have any questions, if you're on Zoom, then you can either just post them in the chat on Zoom, or you can just interrupt Ryan. He told me that was okay. He told us all that was okay before everyone joined. So feel free to interrupt. Well, feel free to find a reasonable entry point. Right? Don't talk over him. If you're on Twitch, I'll be monitoring chat. And if you have any questions, I'll make sure that Ryan sees them. So that's the plan. Does it sound good to everyone? Your stunned silence is very reassuring. So excellent. Roll, Ryan. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to start sharing my screen. Super pumped to be talking with you all. I know under different circumstances, I would be live in Columbus, but this is awesome over the internet. Thankful we have the technology to make that happen. So I'm going to be sharing this as a PDF mode tonight. I went to broadcast Keynote and realized I was not on the latest version that lets you stream it to Zoom, but that I don't foresee that causing any problems. Updating Keynote right before giving a talk is probably not wise, so opted for the PDF export instead. So yes, as Guy said, I am Ryan Lanciaux. If you can spell my last name, you can find me on Twitter. But that's neither here nor there. So I'm really into code and software, as you might have guessed, considering that we are here at a meetup. Really love front-end technology, mostly focused on JavaScript these days. And within that realm, mostly on React. Do a little bit of Vue and some other things too, but mostly focused on React. Really big into the developer community. I help run the JavaScript meetup here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I really like coffee. I love talking about coffee. When I give talks at conferences, it's kind of fun because when I say coffee and I'm giving like an early morning talk, you get like a round of applause just for mentioning coffee. So it's kind of a fun thing to talk about. And in my free time, dabble a little bit in music production. I have 4 children, so that free time is kind of few and far between these days. So yeah, I'm a very, very big proponent of remote work. I know right now everybody's a big proponent of remote work, but been doing remote work for some shape or form of it for the last 8 or so years. I've had some interesting things that have come up with remote work though. As I mentioned before, I have a number of children, and a couple years back, I was home with 2 of them who were playing quietly in the other room till I was on a video call. So they're being super respectful of the video call, not wanting to interrupt. But things got really quiet. And as a parent of children that were this age at the time, when things get quiet, it's a little disconcerting. And I have a very responsible 5-year-old sent an email. So here we go. The other 3-year-old at the time was potty training, and sitting in this video call, and this email pops up. So kind of an emergency. I was super impressed that the quick thinking led to sending an email, but it was like kind of the scenario where interrupting a video call is a welcome thing. So I want to start off with an example and talk about what we're eventually going to be getting into, This, as the title kind of denotes, this is about Webpack and why you might not need it. So I'm going to switch which window I am sharing. And this, we're going to look at this awesome TypeScript example from somebody in the community. This is at lemoncode/react TypeScript samples on GitHub. But what this is a login container, as we see here. I'm going to stop the server and fire it up again. And if you have a stopwatch or a mental stopwatch, start tracking this with me, okay? So what we have is basically handful of pages, components, some model stuff, nothing too large. Run yarn start. See, it's firing up Webpack dev server. TypeScript's kicking in, doing some things. It's almost done. Doing some more things. All right, so 5 seconds. When I'm not running all the video stuff, it's normally a bit faster, but still, I guess that helps make my point a little bit more. So this is a pretty small size application. And then if we want to go ahead and change something here, so we have this login container and update this. Okay, so I just made a change. We're compiling. And so that was a lot quicker, but we're still doing this compile step. Right, and let's see. I'm going to stop the browser preview and open it back up. Normally, I would do this in a normal browser, but trying to share the windows here effectively. So there we go. Again, I'll just take this back out and we'll see the compile stuff happen again. So not too bad, but I don't know. I like a really fast feedback cycle, especially on a smaller app. So on a bigger app, when we have more files, more things that need to get compiled, this is only a bigger problem. Now, there's some ways around that, but the other thing is I I don't necessarily want to configure all these things or make sure I have a number of plugins installed the right way. So we're going to take a look at a different way of doing things that we're going to talk about for the remainder of this evening. So I'm going to go back to sharing. So keep in mind that last one was about 5 seconds. We're going to run this on 8081 instead of 8080. I'm mostly saying this for myself because I'll be refreshing port 8080 and being really confused why it's not updating when I type things. Okay, so we're getting an error with my browser, but other than that, it's actually running in 19 milliseconds. Okay, so we come back over here to this browser preview, refresh this on 8081. There we go. Now I'm going to make a change similarly. You see that? Really fast. So the tool that we're using here is called Snowpack, and we're going to talk a bit about this and some other surrounding things throughout this talk. Okay, so before we get into like the actual Snowpack things and the Webpack specific things, it's pretty helpful to figure out how we got here. There's been a lot of things that have happened over the last however many years in web development that kind of has influenced this trajectory and kind of the tooling that we have today. A lot of times when I see people mention about how nice things were, I appreciate that sentiment, but I also keep in mind some of the things that we weren't doing previously before some of the tooling that we have today existed. So a long time ago in web development, this is actually just a few years ago. I don't know. I think JavaScript years go a lot faster than standard years. But just, I mean, a few years back even, a lot of times the web apps that I was building, instead of having, you know, compile steps and build steps and transpilers and all these things, I kind of start off with some markup. I'd include some CSS files, maybe some jQuery and some custom JavaScripts. Anybody else relate to that one? Yeah, cool. Yep. And a lot of people are still doing this today, and that's awesome. But for me personally, building some different things that require more steps. But I know a lot of times when people kind of lament the tooling and things that we have today, they kind of envision this model that kind of more closely resembles using HTML and including some things and getting some different output. That's a fine model today, but yeah. There's some challenges with this approach, especially going back some years. One of the ones here is browsers support only so many simultaneous connections. And back when this was a major problem for me, this is from Stack Overflow. I want to call out something here. So this is a Stack Overflow answer. You know, it's the 425 votes and so on and so forth. It's the top answer on this question. It's from 2009, so not necessarily accurate as of today. Thankfully, it was updated in 2015, so still maybe not exactly what we're looking for, but kind of talking about the history of web development, this was a problem, right? So before, if we were including a bunch of JavaScript files and a bunch of CSS files and so on and so forth, we would be limited by how many persistent connections could happen or simultaneous connections could be happening at the same time. So if you look here, Firefox 2 and 3 had 2 and 6. Internet Explorer 7 through 10, the maximum was 8. So some of the things that I see happening in applications probably won't work out so well, or the time to initial paint would be pretty slow. We don't have the same levels today, but that's still something where if we're loading a ton of files, that might be something that should be a consideration. To kind of get around this though, a technique called bundling, where we'd combine files into a single file, came onto the scene. And at least for me, this was life-changing. This coupled with bundling, and then this is kind of a segue into something else that we're not talking about too much tonight, but in that same era, Internet Explorer had a maximum number of CSS properties. And if you're using a framework like Bootstrap or something, coupled with some other things, you could hit those maximum CSS properties. Not in every app, but I was on one app that was constantly needing to juggle how many CSS properties were active. So it's kind of a rough time, but bundling came in, and this max file that the browser network could have ongoing was basically eliminated by having that opportunity to kind of bundle our apps. And another kind of similar technique was minification. So that would be where we would remove white space and comments and things that were not necessary. But instead of saying include jQuery, include my custom scripts, we'd actually start running things through a build process or a bundle process that would kind of do this bundling and minification. So back here, we're actually getting into this stuff where we're not just writing script files and appending it to our HTML. There was actually a step that would happen before we would actually produce the web application. Another major consideration for things that I would be using, at least as far as like JavaScript and CSS was concerned, is browser support. Going back to like the can I use type tables from 5-10 years ago, quite a bit different than they are today. And especially when a major segment of the people using a web application would be using Internet Explorer, that was a big a big thing to consider. And also script order. So there'd be times where if I had multiple JavaScript files and I didn't include them in the right order, they wouldn't work. So if I didn't include jQuery first, any file that referenced jQuery would also not work. And kind of making this even a little bit more complicated is what was happening in my case, at least when building apps, is I would have, my CSS frameworks, sometimes jQuery, sometimes just pure JavaScript, but more frameworks kind of started coming onto the scene. So this is things like Angular and React and so on. So here's a couple logos of those. Obviously, Vue and Svelte are a little bit newer to the scene, but I like this logo, so I put it on this slide. But using frameworks kind of compounded the problems that we might have encountered trying to use these things. In one project that I was on particularly, it started out using jQuery. Later, it started using Angular 1 as well. I am not too versed on the Angular community stuff, so I always call it Angular 1. I don't know if that's right. No, is it AngularJS? Is that the one? Awesome. Okay, I'll try to make a mental note of when I talk about the early days of Angular to always say AngularJS. So I started out with jQuery. That worked well. Pulled in jQuery from a CDN, added Angular. That's when things started to get bundle steps. There was a change in direction, and we started using React too back in the early days of React. So like about 5 years ago, give or take. And so this application, we were translating it from Angular to React, kind of piecemeal. But having a number of frameworks, a number of CSS type things going on could be kind of challenging to keep track of. Okay, this thing's using this JavaScript property that's not supported. We're using some CSS here that's not supported in IE. Kind of keeping track of all that was challenging. Going to talk about the JavaScript things that were supported and not supported. Who's familiar with this 6 to 5?
Not me.
This was life-changing for me. So instead of trying to keep the JavaScript around that was kind of supported by Internet Explorer, in most cases ES5, this 6 to 5 library allowed me to write code targeting ES6 and transpile it to version 5 of JavaScript. So make a mental image of this logo here, right? Okay. Today, you might know it as BABEL. So 6 to 5 doesn't quite translate to what version of ES or ECMAScript we're on today. So the name was updated to BABEL. But this was life-changing. But again, we introduced another build step to our tooling to support 6 to 5, which is now BABEL. Taking modern JavaScript and converting it to something that the browser understands. So a lot of tools came about to kind of try to help make our lives easier. These are the logos that I could fit on this slide. Could probably make a couple more slides from this era of some of the build tools. And very, very helpful. I mean, these solved problems that people were having, and still to this day, obviously people are using NPM and some folks are successfully using some of these other tools. But just the sheer amount of these tools and how they were different made switching from one application to another pretty challenging, right? So I would, and then to further complicate that, there's different module types that different apps would use. So some would use like AMD for like require type stuff. Some would use UMD or CommonJS in Node. And then there would be things that would try to, there were libraries like require.js and some others that would say, okay, I want to take one of these things that's made for this specific module type and make it so it works with this other type, or make it so it works in the browser, stuff like Browserify. Again, that's not what we're here to talk about, but one of the things I've noticed is it was pretty exhausting trying to keep up with all of these things. I know people talk about that today, which is a true statement. There's a lot going on, and it can be pretty tiring trying to keep up. But for me personally, trying to keep up from project to project saying, all right, I need to use this build tool and this other transpiler here and this thing here. That was a bit of a challenge. And yeah, kind of like I was saying, is like every project was different. There were no two projects that were set up exactly the same. If the teams I was working with or the teams I was on set up standards, that might have been different, but still, that's like creating a manual process. Obviously, these processes are very important, but I wanted something a little bit more standardized across like the JavaScript ecosystem. And thankfully, Webpack came onto the scene and solved a lot of problems that I was having, and many others as well, and does, again, to this day, which is awesome. So there's a lot of benefits that Webpack brings to the table. You know, it kind of keeps track of that dependency graph, so I don't have to say, import this file, and then import this other file below it because it depends on this one. And if I import this one here, it'll break. Now, there's still some challenges with like circular dependencies. Sometimes it's mostly got that all squared away, but this dependency graph just by itself is life-changing. One of the other points here is that it has a lot of users. This is one that I would say, who here is not using Webpack? Yeah, so, okay. But a lot of times, I would say when talking with other JavaScript developers, at least 80% of them on their mainline projects are using Webpack, which is really interesting to see. And a lot of times with those kind of community open source tools, the tool that has the larger community seems to move further faster just because there's more people involved. Obviously, that's not always the case, but it really seems to be the case with Webpack. Kind of to that end, it's really well documented and has some nice features like tree shaking, kind of like dead code elimination and some other things like that. So I love this from the Webpack docs. Just kind of a graphic that says, look, here's all our stuff that we're using to build our app. We push it through Webpack and we get our kind of production assets out of that procedure. So a lot of times when I'm using Webpack, I'll use Webpack to kind of orchestrate all the tooling. So if I'm using BABEL or TypeScript or any of these things, things to kind of pre-process my CSS, it's happening through Webpack in one way or another, which is really, really handy. And Webpack has a lot of plugins that are really nice too. Again, kind of goes back to that community involvement type thing, right? And a lot of framework starters today. So like, again, I'm mostly focused on React. If you download Create React App, for instance, and you start a new React app with Create React App, you're using Webpack behind the scenes. It kind of abstracts that away a little bit, but it's using Webpack, and a lot of other frameworks are as well. But there are some problems here. So one of those is, so that Create React app that we were just talking about, when you install that, you're actually installing 200 megs of dependencies. There was a time a couple months ago where I was running out of space on my computer, and I, for the life of me, could not figure out why. I'm like, okay, I don't have lots of photos. I don't have lots of music or videos or any of this. The things that people, or video games, you know, none of that. I'm just like, okay, what is going on? And I ran some tools against my hard drive space, and it turns out my projects folder was multiple gigabytes of data, mostly coming from node modules. So some of that is just something that comes with the JavaScript ecosystem, but this kind of sheer thing where I'm creating a new like hello world app and with Create React app, getting tons of data that I maybe wouldn't realize that I'm getting. And if you go on Twitter and look for Webpack, there's lots of commentary on it. There's this mentality sometimes that Webpack is really, really hard to work with. I think it is an indicator that there's some challenges there, but it's one of those things that is a trade-off. There's both some challenges there, but it does some great things, kind of, you know, consistency plugins and all that. but that is a mentality that's there. And I don't know if any of you've experienced this. There's been times where I would try to figure out why a build was slow or why something was happening in a build process. And instead of like, okay, I'm going to build this feature and I'm going to get this thing done, it was like I'd spend a day trying to figure out why something was happening in Webpack and come back to find what was actually going on. There's just a lot of things going on there sometimes. And again, sometimes it's kind of like, I just want to do something simple. Like I want to create a hello world app. And a lot of times it turns into something like this, where you're building like a Megazord or Voltron or whatever you want to call it, but you're building up this thing that you're kind of getting away from the simplest thing that could possibly work. And that's something that I think a lot of people miss. I know kind of when I'm trying to play around with a tool or something, trying to figure out a new technique or just kind of start off an application, sometimes I don't want a lot of complexity. I just want to say, I just want to write my code and go, right? And so one of the things that I did when I was trying to say, okay, there has to be a different way. If I'm just trying to like build something for myself or trying to kind of play around with something, or maybe something else, you know, Webpack's been around for a while now, maybe something else has come out that's made this a nicer process. Maybe I'll take a look at other bundlers. So there are a couple other bundlers on the scene. There's actually more than these two, but these seem to be the two most popular ones outside of Webpack for JavaScript stuff. So there's Parcel, which from the documentation says it's a blazing fast, zero configuration web application bundler. And then there's Rollup, which has a lot of nice features as well. Has anybody worked with either of these? Cool. If you ever feel like checking out some of the other bundler things that are in the JavaScript ecosystem, they're both really cool. But Parcel is one that I kind of gravitate towards. So to create a new Parcel app, I would say I'm going to globally install my Parcel bundler. I'll go ahead and make a React component. So I have like just a generic like hello world component, let's say. And I'm saying I have a component that's say hello, receives a prop called name, and then it returns h1 hello name. Okay. And then in an index.js file, I might include React and React DOM and my component I just created to say hello. And I'd say, all right, use this component with the name everyone and kind of do the default thing to register React with the browser. Pretty much a hello world type thing. With Parcel, instead of doing stuff with Webpack where I'm defining an entry and all this stuff, I have an index.html file. And I'm saying this index.js file, so this file that we're talking about here, I'm including that in script source. So if you remember one of those earlier slides where I had index.html, I was importing some JavaScript and some CSS and just kind of refreshing my browser. Parcel kind of gets us back to that mindset. I would say Parcel, and I would point it at index.html. It's going to do some stuff and it'll build and we can run it. So that was a hello world application. We had basically two components. One of them was actually registering React with the DOM, but that's still 1.5 seconds. It's pretty fast. I mean, if we're complaining about a 1.5 seconds, that's maybe not the best way to spend our time, but it's still a bundler. So some of the things that are kind of causing problems with bundlers or might cause challenges with bundlers still exist. It's a nicer experience in that you know, all we did was create our JavaScript and register it with our HTML file, but there's some other things that are going on. So this is from the Snowpack docs. I'm gonna talk about algorithms for a second and not like, we're not gonna do any like reverse sorting of a B tree on a whiteboard or anything like that. But just kind of one of the concepts that kind of drives some of the things that could be challenging with bundlers is it's a complexity of 0n or on. And what that means is every time we add more files, it's going to take more time, more computation complexity, and some other things. Now, there's plugins and some other things that we can do to kind of help us cache things and make our process better, but that's more work. So from the lowest level thing, what we're doing is we're actually we're causing more computation time. So we're saying that, hey, this is an algorithm that will grow linearly. So when we have more files, we're going to have more computation. So this is just a general guide here about this algorithmic complexity and time calculations and complexity calculations. But this applies directly to bundlers. So from Wikipedia, which no is not like not something you generally want to cite all over the place, but what we're dealing with here is when we have more files. Look at this graph. When n is larger, so is our the computations that we're performing. When I bundle something, kind of trying to when I'm building something, I would prefer the compile time to be more like a 1. So what that means is it's constant throughout. No matter how many files I have, it's the same time involvement. So there's a couple things that we can do here. Is we can kind of think about what the problem is that we're encountering. So there's ways to make bundlers faster through plugins and so on. But what's the problem that we actually want to solve? So there's a book I was reading that mentioned Disney World. And Disney World had this problem where they were finding that people weren't happy to wait in line. Who loves going to an amusement park, spending all this money and waiting in line? So yeah, I can't hear the crickets in your backyard, Matthew, but I'm anticipating when asking that question, that's the kind of results that we get. So some folks at Disney World said, well, we cannot make the line shorter. There's no way. We can add more rides and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, our lines are kind of a result of the length of time of the rides and how many people are allowed in the park and so on and so forth. But one of the things that they did was they came up with this schema to say, we want the experience of waiting in the line to be something that people enjoy. So they reframed the problem and said, you know what, we're going to make this process of waiting in line something that is enjoyable. All right, so that's not what we're talking about with Webpack. We're not going to say, we're going to come back to our bundler and make that an enjoyable process. But what we do want to do is come up with what it is that we're actually trying to solve. When I'm building an application, what I want to do is I want to get my code that I'm writing to the browser as quickly as possible. So I can have that fast feedback cycle. Like, is the code I'm writing working? Is it accomplishing the goal that I'm setting out to accomplish? So instead of trying to find a faster bundler or a way to bundle things faster, let's think about it this way. Why do we run a bundler, right? So we talked about this at the beginning. We have, back a couple of years back, there were a lot of problems and things with different browser technologies that we might not be encountering so much today. So do we need to bundle in every circumstance? And one of the things that I found is not in every circumstance. So there might be this opportunity that we can get away from using bundlers, especially when we're doing development. We control the browser that we're using. We control a lot of the environment stuff. And so some of these things we're doing to kind of say, all right, we want to get around the max number of open requests and all this stuff we might not need to do. Browser technology has come a long way since a handful of years back. And we can take advantage of that when we're developing our applications too. So one of these things is HTTP2. And from a high level, it's a way to do things in a faster way. You see here, it's fully multiplexed instead of ordered and blocking. That's huge. Servers can do a lot more stuff to push responses to the browser, better compression, and so on. So this topic by itself could be its own talk. There's a lot going on here, but browsers oftentimes support a lot of these things now without extra overhead. You can see here, sorry, if you're using Opera Mini, you're probably out of luck, but most of the other browsers support HTTP2. caching, right? So one of the big problems in computer science, this has gotten a lot better too. So instead of, when we were making a lot of network requests, what would happen if I hit refresh? Sometimes we could be getting the same file over and over again and just transferring that. There's something called etag, which helps us perform caches better. So this is from MDN. Basically, we're saying it lets caches be more efficient and save bandwidth. Doesn't need to resend the full thing if the content hasn't changed. So this is another thing that's supported by a lot of the browsers. If we looked at the can I use information, it's almost across the board. And this is just kind of a little like diagram of what's going on here. It's like, oh, this isn't modified, just keep going with what you got. So the old browsers had a cache, but the stuff that browser technology is doing today is a lot better. And there's also service workers, which kind of unlock some powerful things that we can do, kind of like some of the HTTP2 and other things. It's a bit outside the scope of this talk. And some of the things we could do with service workers, while incredible, could be a series of talks, not just one. So, but again, another thing that's in a lot of the browsers now. In JavaScript support. So before, where I'm using 6.5 or BABEL as it is now, and trying to say, I want to write modern JavaScript in a way that the browser understands, depending on what browser I'm using, a lot of times the things that I'm using BABEL for are built into the browser. Even things like the import statement, right? So this is from Kent C. Dodds, but he's demoing here that he's using inside of an index.html file, just a plain HTML file. He's using an import like this. So import append div from this JavaScript file that we have up here. And yeah, just kind of something that's built into the browser now. Without BABEL, traditionally, if you wanted to use like an import statement, you'd have to use BABEL and transpile it to something that a browser would understand. A lot of the browsers now don't need that. So kind of going back to this graph, instead of doing this bundle step that's causing us to have some additional computation here, we no longer need to consider that. If we're directly editing one file, loading our page over again, kind of like we were seeing in that first example, it was loading almost instantly. In most cases, less than 50 milliseconds, which is pretty incredible. So kind of talking about that developer experience, I want a really fast feedback cycle. I don't want to see things go through a transpilation step or a compilation step, or kind of, all right, I'm rebundling all my CSS, things like that. If there's a way for me to just say, I changed a JavaScript file and I'm seeing those updates right away without extra configuration, without setting up all this like hot module reloading or things like that, that's pretty compelling, to me at least. And there's a number of tools now that are kind of taking this mentality and saying, all right, the browsers support a lot of things. We can do a little bit of stuff on the developer machine and get pretty far to make a nicer experience for the developer. And sometimes even the person kind of using the stuff that we're building. And so this tool that I like a lot is called Snowpack. So some of the benefits, there's no bundling at all in development. Kind of one of the things I keep trying to hammer home, it's really fast. There's very little build step. You'll see that we can add some things that kind of start a build step. And it's mostly run when we install things or when we start things up for the first time. So from the Snowpack docs, we're talking about traditional browser on top. There's kind of like a normal build step, does some bundling. We get some extra time. With Snowpack, I change a file, I get that file right away. That's the only thing that updated. Everything else can be pulled in from the cache, which is a really, really nice experience to me. And kind of similar to that Webpack thing that we were seeing before, Snowpack does some things. This is from like the 1.0 version of the docs, where what would happen is you would install something into your node modules. And when you installed it, Snowpack would say, I only need to transpile this once. So when I install it, I'm going to do whatever I need to do to make it work in the browser. and it would install it into something called Web Modules. Similar kind of mindset now, but this isn't necessarily as pronounced, but we'll see that in a second here. So here's an example of Snowpack 1.0. This is going to be using Preact. Anybody use Preact? Played around with Preact? I likewise mostly have played around with Preact, but never done anything like productionized. But it's kind of a fun experiment. I'd say, okay, I'm going to install Preact and a thing called HTM. If you're familiar with JSX, this library tries to get a way to get some kind of HTML markup in with our components. Preact also kind of has that concept of components like React and others do. So what we see here is when we run Snowpack, after we would run our npm install, Snowpack would go through and say, all right, I'm going to do my work, and it installed HTM and Preact. So we look at that web modules directory, you see that there's some stuff here that Snowpack did for us. And kind of similar to the parcel bundler example, we could create an HTML file and include our app.js file. From there, that would be all we need to do. Besides actually writing the component, actually, that's an important step. But we go and bring in HTM and Preact, and we'd write our component. This would just say hello world, and we'd render it out. And so at the time with version 1.0 of Snowpack, it didn't really have an opinion on how you served your code. There's a tool called Server. It's one I've read, so I'm probably not saying it right, but that's how I'm going to read it. So let's see. What this would do is it would let you run an HTTP server that would reload this file. So Snowpack didn't really have an opinion on how things were loaded, but this is the one that I used. And when running that, go to localhost 8080 and type hello world, and we get our example. All right, Snowpack 2.0 came out. 1.0's not been out for too long, but 2.0 came out relatively recently, and it's added a lot of nice new features. There was an example that I had for the 1.0 that I removed because it's no longer useful. And I just talk about it briefly. React traditionally does not support ES modules. And when you wanted to use, React was not shipped as an ES module. When you wanted to use like the native browser import with React, you actually had to install React from a community module, which a lot of times I'm not super comfortable with that if it's not like a known entity shipping the thing that the whole app is dependent upon. I mean, I know things in the JavaScript ecosystem like LeftPad happened, but that wasn't like the framework that's running the entire app. So a little disconcerting with that. But with 2.0, that's no longer an issue. What we could do now is npx, which is kind of a thing where we can run a CLI command that we don't have installed on our computer, part of the npm ecosystem. You say npx create Snowpack app. So I'm used to typing create React app or create React native app. Give the app a name, and then pass in a template. So when I'm building something with React, like the example that we were looking at earlier, that's app template React. So under the Snowpack organization. And that works. So this app that we looked at the beginning, which I can jump back to in a second here, that's actually what that was doing. Is I took the examples from our Create React app with TypeScript version, or the TypeScript examples, and placed the components inside of the Snowpack app. So this one that we just looked at, this install command, was for the template, the React template. Who all is using TypeScript? Yeah. Who all has no plans ever of using TypeScript?
Not me.
All right. So this made me laugh because I was in this boat for a while. I'm like, I got everything I need with JavaScript. I'm not using TypeScript. And yeah, for the last couple of years, I've been using TypeScript a lot. So thankfully, kind of like we have this template that we just talked about, there's also app template React TypeScript as well. Okay. And there are many others. These are like the official Snowpack templates. There are a lot of community ones too. So if you don't see something that you're using or want to use on there, and you are looking at Snowpack, there are many, many others. So you have, lit element, Preact, Svelte view. Angular is missing. From what I was gathering from some of the conversations happening, getting Angular working in this paradigm is a little bit of a challenge. And I've seen demos where people kind of are getting close, but maybe not the full experience. But maybe there is, but I wasn't able to find that. But anyways, there's quite a few project templates out there that are the officially supported community ones. And then for production, right? So some of this, works really well, but we don't control the environment that the people that are visiting our web apps are using. So it might be nice to assume that they're using the latest and greatest browser technologies, but in some cases, they're on Internet Explorer from 10 years ago. And depending on the industry, those still need to be supported. I mean, I even think about some of the like e-commerce or retailer type things. If, Internet Explorer version 9 or 10 or whatever makes up, 4% of your visitors, if you're getting millions of hits a day, that's a pretty large portion of your visitors. So not something that you necessarily want to miss out on. So for production, Snowpack has this mentality that it's like, you should bundle because you want to, not because you need to, like, especially in development. So the thought is if I'm wanting that kind of experience where I'm changing a file and I'm getting back to that mentality that kind of started out like when I was developing with, it's kind of nice to say, all right, you know what, I don't necessarily want to bundle while I'm developing, but some cases you definitely need to bundle, especially if you have those use cases where you're supporting older browsers. Obviously there's ways around it, but so the title of the talk where it says you might not need Webpack, in that case where you're supporting those browsers, you might need Webpack. There's other things you can do. Snowpack has this this kind of like pipeline for your build where you can kind of inject things how you want to. But one of the things that's the most straightforward way of doing this is through using Webpack. Snowpack actually has a plugin. So this is in snowpackconfig.json. This is from the Snowpack docs. You can just say, when I'm building, use the Webpack plugin. And it'll run that. When you run that build step, you'll actually run with Webpack. And it does a lot of the things for you. You don't necessarily need to maintain that Webpack config directly, but there's ways to do that as well. But in those cases, you might be using Webpack. And so this was mostly about Snowpack, but there's been a lot of other things in the community. And one that has been on my radar for a little bit is Pika. It's kind of there's a lot of things within Pika that allow you to kind of bypass traditional things in like the Node and JavaScript community. Some of the things that just kind of exist because they solve a problem that was encountered, some years back, and maybe they're kind of rethinking some of those things. So Pika is actually by the same people that make Snowpack. It's really interesting stuff. You see here, there's a code editor that they kind of are working on. I think it's kind of been on hold with some of the other things that they're working on. And kind of also having almost like a CDN for NPM packages. There's a handful of things that do this, like if you're familiar with Unpackage, but they kind of have a different take on some of those things. And then Snowpack, as we were kind of looking at. One of the other things, I know some folks use Vue here. So this is from the creator of Vue. he created a tool. He kind of said, hey, I had this idea about using just the native stuff, right? Does all these things. And he is like amazingly prolific at building things. And so this note I thought was pretty funny. He's like, I had this idea and it's 6 a.m. and it's working. And it's like, oh man, it's pretty impressive. But this one's called Vite or Vite or Vite. I think it's based off of a French word. And if you saw my last name, Lanciaux, it's a very French word. But if I understand correctly, that's what it's based off of. But this is a tool almost exactly like Snowpack, but it's very high on my radar because of the community that's involved in building it, and has a similar kind of life cycle. So I create my file, something in development just uses the native browser technology and almost like near instant refresh. And so like Snowpack, how it has that production build step, this also does as well. So Snowpack kind of has some of the plugins for Webpack and kind of gives some other options. Going through the docs on this one, it actually kind of calls out more roll up. So where the docs on Snowpack say, hey, you can do your own thing, but we have a plugin for Webpack. This one's more tied to roll up, which is great. It has a lot of nice features as well. I have not played around with this one as much as Snowpack, but it's very, very high on my radar based on the community that's building it and the authors behind it. So I think I would be shocked if we don't see tools like Snowpack and Vite or Vite kind of being used more and more. So that is all that I have for slides tonight. What questions could I take or questions could I answer?
So it sounds like in your dev environment, it operates really quickly, obviously. But when you say you're going to have what you've written built for prod, I guess you don't really care if it takes as long to put that together. The bundling process is still a part of that, right? The big talk it sounds like you had with this was in dev. Bundling is, I guess, more targeted or skipped altogether in favor of speed with Snowpack. But in prod, that's still in place, I guess.
Yeah. So with Snowpack 1.0, the bundling for prod experience wasn't quite as fleshed out, and the thought was, hey, you don't necessarily need to bundle anymore. With 2.0, they kind of said, well, there are a lot of cases where you might want to bundle. So they made that experience a lot nicer. So you can release to prod using just the native browser technologies without doing that bundle step still. And that's one of the things that is supported. But in a lot of cases, just with the nature of the uncontrolled environment, you don't necessarily know what kind of browser the people who are visiting the sites and apps that you build are going to be using. And that's where having that bundle step, you can really say, all right, I have this really fine-grained control over things. I'm tossing all the random JavaScript files into one script and so on and so forth, depending on the the trade-offs that you're considering to make that work.
Thanks.
Yeah, Matthew.
Yeah, so I can see how this could be really good at improving performance, especially when you're running pure unit tests. And that got me to thinking have you seen any similar improvements when running unit tests with more component-based test frameworks like Jest or Jasmine, or even the actual non-unit test frameworks like Cypress?
That is actually a fantastic question and not something I've looked into too much, but has me thinking about a lot of things, because I could see that where you would be able to speed up your tests like a ton if you don't need to kind of build things or bundle things, or kind of have something that happens before you run your test. If you're just saying, this thing I'm running understands this thing, so just go, that would be awesome and would speed things up. But yeah, unfortunately, I'm not sure. Something I'll look into after this. Yeah, Doug.
If Snowpack is only compiling your dependencies once, how does it handle tree shaking? Is it only doing that on a production build?
Yeah, and that's also a good question. I've seen things in the docs that I can look up real quick. It does have some way to do tree shaking. I do believe that it's mostly on the production builds. But with 1.0, it was doing something to achieve tree shaking without the same kind of build step, which is really kind of shocking to me. But unfortunately, it's been a little while since I've read that article. But there's some stuff that they were doing to kind of make tree shaking or tree shaking like operations feasible.
Okay.
So if you were putting this together in a raw app, like you were kind of demonstrating in the beginning, near the beginning of this presentation, and you were talking about 6 to 5 or BABEL, is the code compatibility, is BABEL actually baked into Snowpack, or is that if you're writing it with React, that's BABEL is part of its build system and it just inherits into Snowpack? Or if I was going to build an app in the raw, would I have to worry about BABEL on top of Snowpack just to get my app working with some compatibility issues?
Yeah, so with 1.0, you actually would say, if I'm using JSX, I'm including something to handle this BABEL step for me. I think that Snowpack 2.0 is still doing something with BABEL behind the scenes, because JSX, for instance, that's totally like a React thing that the browser has no idea about. I know some people kind of jokingly and not jokingly were suggesting building in JSX directly into like the HTML spec, but unfortunately we're not there yet. So, or fortunately, depending on where you're coming from on that one. But yeah, I think it's still using BABEL to kind of achieve the JSX capabilities to kind of translate that into something that the browser understands.
That reminds me of a discussion around the table at Pillar Technologies after a JavaScript meetup. And I think I was listening to Doug asking, like, so what's the future of JavaScript? We continually have all these new features that are coming down the pipe from the ECMA specification that we can't natively use. So are we always going to be using BABEL? It's a very interesting comment that you made, Doug.
That's why they invented WebAssembly.
Well, I guess as far as I can tell, I think the end state that what they're looking for is that we will at least be able to jettison things eventually and different projects at different times. Right now, I'm doing a lot of work with WebVR, which has just changed to the WebXR standard, which just really was only implemented last year. So if you are writing an application that uses WebXR, you must be using a recent browser. So if that is a key part of the project, then those older browsers are automatically out of the running. Just like, years ago, I built something that depended on the index database. And that was just absolutely key to how the application ran. So on browsers that didn't support it, like Internet Explorer, I just said, it isn't going to work. And so I was free to ignore anything that it didn't support. So, so you can't, we're not at the stage, not all projects can ignore the old browsers yet, but some of them can.
I think of, like, if you had a dependency that you're pulled down and that person was like, hey, I'm going to use generators. And I don't think there's any browser that can do that yet, right? Or maybe Chrome can. But, when is that going to come down the pipe? So, like, you're going to have to do some sort of transpile step at some point, either in development or in prod.
Well, for browser stuff, definitely. Don't forget, there's also Node. And if you're writing something primarily for Node, well, that's just up. If you want to use that, you might say the latest version of my package requires a recent version of Node.
Yeah, and that's it's all those trade-offs that go into when you build things. It's just like all those things that need to be considered. So it's kind of unfortunately some of the stuff like this directly, if I wanted to say, I want to take advantage of all these new browser things. If I know that the people that are using the thing I'm building are using a modern browser, then hey, that's great. But kind of in those scenarios where I don't know, or I have analytics data backing that up, that no, they're not all using the new stuff, then sometimes different technique has to be applied.
And of course, there's potentially the ability to serve different versions to different browsers if you have a sufficiently sophisticated setup. And I think that's what some of the biggest players do, that when you make that first request, it tries to make it does do browser sniffing to the extent of trying to figure out, well, okay, are you running a modern browser? Then I'll serve you the real thing. And if you're running an older browser or something I don't recognize, then you get the transpiled to ES5.
Yeah, and it's like one of those things where those kind of scenarios where they have that in place is awesome, because then the people who have the browsers that support all the new stuff, they can potentially get a much smaller bundle size, and things just move a lot faster for them. And then the people who need all the polyfills and so on to make it work, get that other version.
And if we get that sort of thing in place, then we can really make a good case to people. Well, that's why you should be using a modern browser. And I mean, a lot of the people, it's beyond their control, because there's a lot of people who cannot afford a new computer, and that's legit. But at least to the bean counter, well, if you can convince a bean counter that people's time actually has value, then you could convince them that giving their people modern machines would help. But the problem then is too many organizations don't actually value their people's time.
I've been involved on projects where a legacy application that was used by a handful of people only supported a specific version of Internet Explorer. So that was another thing sometimes, is where the organization would have the capability to get new browsers, but just because of a different legacy app, it'd be targeting a very specific browser.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting you say that. And the new Edge is supposed to be the fix for that, right? And I'm curious to see if companies actually get on board with that, where they can. I know Internet Explorer has an end of life. They've set the dead date for it. So I'm interested to see how many companies set that configuration to run Edge in IE mode versus the Chromium mode, and how many you say, do you know what? Let's just fix our app so we don't have to use it in IE mode anymore. So it'll be interesting to see how that transitions. I don't know if anyone's already seen that in their business. I'd be interested.
I mean, Edge uses in education anyways has increased a lot. I mean, it's still a subset of what Chrome is. I don't know about, I mean, anyways, anybody using Edge is going to get ES6 anyways, so whether they're on the old or the new. As long as they're on Edge, I'm happy.
Yeah, but they have the ability to set it in IE compatibility mode. So I'd be interested to see what happens with that, if people take advantage of that, or if they just upgrade their apps.
I feel like nowadays people are designing more for Chrome and not caring, and so we're going to back to that same ecosystem of one browser, designing for one browser only, which that's where we ended up with IE. So you got to be careful.
Yeah. Except for Safari is now going to be the new bottleneck, because in Mac, every browser is Safari underneath it, right? It just has
iOS, not Mac OS.
Oh, not Mac OS? Oh, I thought Mac OS was also that way as well.
No, maybe on the ARM platforms, but
yeah.
Oh no.
There.
Ooh. I never considered that about the ARM platforms. I'm hoping not.
Yeah.
And then Safari actually isn't. You're not only just using Safari on iOS. If you serve up media like an audio or video file on your page, it's actually using QuickTime's internal WebKit browser, which has a completely set of different rules you have to pay attention to.
Interesting.
There's a lot of things that I've bumped into on Safari recently too. It's like, oh, I didn't know it rendered things this way. And it's kind of interesting just thinking about some of the considerations that the different browser vendors have to get how things are rendered and stuff.
Safari annoys me, but I like it. I like how they have a stable release pattern, and that keeps us honest.
So Ryan, do you mind turning your screen sharing off?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Well, I feel like we're into conversation mode and probably done with the slides. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Let all the viewers on Twitch. We hit a peak of 3.
Nice.
Let them see everybody.
The most viewers on Twitch I've ever had, so that's awesome.
It's a world record.
Yeah.
Most viewers Ryan Lanciaux has ever had on Twitch. Yeah.
You don't need to mention it's my first time ever having anything on Twitch, but that's
no, absolutely not.
Yeah.
I can neither confirm nor deny that. So. Well, I think we should give Ryan a big round of applause, and then we should continue the conversation. So let's have some scattered applause via Zoom as it's all out of sync.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming.
Yeah, and I hope I didn't just kill the conversation, because we're still streaming and the conversation's pretty good. So if everyone's cool with staying on stream and having the conversation, we'll stay on stream.
Yeah, works for me.
In your talk about Snowpack earlier, was there a part of that you talked about that maybe just went right past me? I didn't pick up on it, but I was looking at their stuff online about who they are, and it looks like a lot of their language is for Pika. That's the company behind it, is about the availability of ES modules and the imports that are there. And it looks like they're somehow that's like a focal point, it looks like, for the strategy of how they've designed the library to, I guess, build on those boundaries, so it only bundles, I guess, in little compartmentalized sections. I'm only picking up on that now. That's
yeah.
in the conversation.
No, I didn't cover that too much, but yeah, that's exactly right. That kind of the thing that I did briefly mention is with Snowpack 1.0, when I would create a React app, I actually had to include that like version of React that was not coming from like, npm install React. It was like install some random organization's version of React that wasn't Snowpack. And it would have like the ES module version of it. It was like a wrapper around React that returned an ES module, so that Snowpack could interact with it for that very reason that you mentioned. That's kind of, it all hinges on that. Like if there is not the ES module thing, can't really use it directly in the browser. And I think there's some things that Snowpack's doing now to kind of make things that aren't necessarily directly ES module compatible in some cases. Don't quote me 100% on that, but I'm pretty sure that's kind of what's going on with the 2.0 stuff a bit. So kind of making that that wrapper, that the community version of React with ES modules, like kind of making that a little bit more baked in.
Doug found that link to the Snowpack tree shaking blog post. Thanks, Doug. I don't know if you want to share it with Twitch.
I actually don't have an easy way to copy and paste it over to Twitch, because I'm streaming from one machine and monitoring Twitch on another. So if anyone else happens to be in Twitch chat, we can paste it in there.
Cool. Yeah, I'm not on it.
The time ever to check out that article, it's like fascinating, and kind of some of the design decisions that they make even within Snowpack, for me, were like eye-opening. I was like, oh wow, I didn't realize that browsers supported this natively now, or 90% of the browsers that people are using day-to-day supported blah, which is really encouraging to see. But like some of the stuff just kind of being around Snowpack a little bit more, it was like, whoa, I didn't even know that this was possible without a transpile step.
Well, one interesting point is not so much what Snowpack is using now, but they're experimenting with using something that's compiled using WASM. So it potentially very fast indeed on client-side machines, which is an interesting sort of technique, and we may see more of that going forward. If something is a fairly self-contained tool, then it's relatively straightforward to compile it for WASM. And so then you can have potential stuff running potentially very fast indeed on the client side. And actually, and you probably have spare, you probably can accommodate another thread relatively easily, since the JavaScript is single threaded for the most part. So
I kind of wonder if someday we're going to see stuff like JSX, like, happen in the browser, but through something that's passing it over to something in WebAssembly and kind of coming back in a roundabout way.
Yeah, probably end state is something rather baroque.
That's kind of, I don't know. I have this feeling like I don't think it's necessarily around the corner, but just kind of seeing some of the things like you just mentioned and some of the other things that people are working on. I'm kind of like, yeah, the end state is, we're not going to, not necessarily I think JavaScript's going to be around, but I think there's going to be a lot more options to not use it too, for folks who don't want to.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think that's actually the big promise of WebAssembly is, I think that's its main feature. It's got lots of interesting features, but I think the really definitive one is that it's a JavaScript liberator. I mean, this is a JavaScript group, but I'm a fan of JavaScript, right? But it's got some weird corners, and
oh yeah,
and WebAssembly will allow you to unify your front and back end in a way that you really haven't been able to do before. Even honestly, in some ways, even with JavaScript, right? If you put JavaScript on the front end and JavaScript on the back end, well, then you're doing Node versus, right? And so if you're just doing native code, if you're not native code, but non-transpiled code, no packing at all, on Node, we're using require. Then on the front end for a modern browser, we're using import. Even that's different, and it's a little frustrating. And so WebAssembly, I think, will make all of that disappear.
Well, I guess I'm skeptical of that, because as far as I can tell from reading it, I haven't actually tried it, it looks like more static languages will naturally be compiled to WebAssembly, but in dynamic languages would naturally be transpiled to JavaScript.
Perhaps. I could also envision someone writing an interpreter in WebAssembly. We should write a JavaScript interpreter in WebAssembly.
I've got another question about Snowpack
Yo, dog, I heard you like V8.
Another thing. So if you have a library that is mainly used in Node, but could also be used, transpiled, it might be using require, the require syntax, the common JS old syntax. How does Snowpack or whatever handle that scenario when it comes to just using ES modules?
Yeah, I think I'd actually have to try that with like some of the libraries that are more kind of geared towards Node to see what it does. I think there's some things where it prefers things that are like ES modules directly, and I think in some cases it can kind of make it work. But I don't know about things that are like common JS style. What would happen?
It'll probably have to do some sort of transpiling and bundling, or not bundling, but just transpiling.
Yeah, I would think so. And unfortunately, I don't know offhand. Most of the stuff I've done is like natively worked with Snowpack without any any manual intervention from my part. So
one of the libraries I've used in the past was a library that basically creates PDFs from JSON objects, and that's a big Node library that we have to include in the project. And yeah, I can see that being kind of difficult.
Yeah, that's one that has been a kind of tough thing to solve when you're doing that kind of stuff. But yeah, I don't know. That's something that would be interesting to try out and see. Because if I could do operations like that 100% on the browser, that'd be pretty cool. So are you all on browsers where you can reliably, like that, the apps and the sites that you're building, are you on the point where you can kind of skip some of the old browsers, or do you get to support them still?
I don't
We're
write
rolling
production code.
out Explore 11 this year in December, which is good news. That's the only thing that's, yeah, that's nice.
That's awesome. Yeah.
I think we technically, on one client, still go back to an older version of an iPad, which would make that not possible.
Yeah, it's for me, it's like just from project to project. Right now, it's more modern browsers, which is really nice. But then when I'm on projects that support the older browsers, it makes me lament that a lot more, just having, you know, that opportunity to not consider it. And then it's like, oh no. So.
Yeah. I mean, there are some legitimate reasons, like I pointed out. I mean, like you're trying to serve a wide variety of the public, and yeah, that's legitimate. But I mean, in a business context, my question is always, well, then when I get told, oh, well, our customers use that, I ask, well, are they paying us for the extra development time? Are they paying a premium to support this? Not that I ever get an answer, but I think that's the key question that's not being asked is, you know, why is this being shifted to us? And well, I'll just say that our society is not great about identifying when costs are being shifted from one group to another.
I know there's all those trade-offs that go into figuring it out, but I've definitely been there where it's just kind of like, well, we've always supported this thing, and it's like, wait, it's you know, it's a decision going back multiple years, and like you said, it's like sometimes there's like super valid reasons for that, and but yeah, sometimes it's just kind of like, well, this is what we've done, and that's what we're doing.
Yeah, it's hard when you have all this technical debt that's written in one format, and then you're like, well, now we're going to upgrade, and it doesn't really jive with everything else. Like we're still rocking Angular 1.3 in one of our applications. It doesn't really work with ES modules and any of that stuff. So, you know, it'd be fun and great to upgrade to that stuff, but would be a tremendous overhaul of our system to make that work.
Yeah, I know, and that's like one of those things where it's like, you know, you have code that's working, and you know it's serving the people who are using it really well, and it's like the kind of making the case for rewriting it, or you know, especially like, you know, going back to like an Angular 1 or Angular JS. I said I try to remember it when I talk about Angular 1.
The whole internet has that problem. And
yeah,
I try my best to say Angular JS as well, and because that's what Google wants.
Even Google is terrible at it. You type in search for something for Angular JS, you get Angular results every time.
Yep.
Most sophisticated AI in the world. No.
Yeah.
Oh.
A question about Snowpack 1 to 2. So did you have like, was it an arduous process to go from Snowpack to 1 to 2, as like arduous as going from Webpack 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 was, if you remember that process?
No, I mean, in a lot of times, I mean, what I even a lot of times when I move stuff from Webpack to Snowpack 2, I just copy the source folder. Like I'll do create Snowpack app, copy the source folder, and it just works. So I mean, that's one way, and I think they have some helpers for kind of making that a little nicer. So yeah, I mean, I don't think I've never experienced it as a painful thing, but not totally using this in production. And there are some helpers on the site too that I think kind of help. See how many times I can say help, I guess, but there's some things on the site where they mention some ways to kind of get up to speed from 1 to 2 quicker, if you have like a very involved project using it.
I do think that the Webpack 3 to 4 and 4 to I think it's 5 now, right? Maybe 6. I think the upgrade process has gotten a lot smoother, and their documentation has much improved. And
oh yeah, even the experience, like just out of the box, it's like, oh, just works. I didn't have to spend 3 days configuring this thing. Yeah, it's that's one of the things that was kind of when I like submit an abstract along with this talk, I'm very careful to say I'm not like just like knocking Webpack, because it's like incredible, and like there's no way that I mean, it's made my life as a developer a million times easier, and I'm, you know, happy using it. It's just kind of sometimes it's nice to say, do I have to use this, or is it just something I'm doing because it's a thing? But yeah, like their developer experience has gotten better. Their docs have improved like incredibly. Like I've been using Webpack kind of since the beginning, and oh my goodness, those like really early docs and really early experience, that would be like, I'm encountering this error that makes no sense to me whatsoever. And I go on the docs and there's nothing. And I go on the GitHub issues or whatever, there's nothing. And it's just like, I mean, that's like anything else. When it's a new thing, obviously there's not going to be as large of a body of work, but it was just kind of, to compare then to now is just like, oh, here's the error and here's 50 people who've already solved it, and I can go on with my life.
Well, I think I'm going to go ahead and shut the stream down. We can keep talking and hanging out. That doesn't mean we have to leave. It just means I'm going to shut the stream down. We've been going, the conversations are going good for a while, but it feels like a good time to do that. So
cool. Sounds good.
So everyone watching on stream and watching the YouTube video later, thank you very much for watching. And the rest of us will see you later. The rest of us are going to hang out and say bad things about you. Bye.